Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries. I'm your host John, and in this episode I'm continuing my discussion with Johannes about our long-running campaigns. And at the start of this episode, we're continuing a discussion of a recent encounter in my Old School Essentials campaign, Smoke and Snow, where the player characters, exploring an underground tomb, found themselves besieged by a small horde of zombies. One of the things I particularly enjoyed with the zombie encounter as well was, because as we've just said, the zombies always go last in initiative. So we never had to worry about rolling for initiative, because we just do one roll per side, like players and NPCs and / monsters. So we never had to worry about that. It's just right, the players are going first, then it's the monsters. Also, just because of the way my rolls happen to fall, and you all being pretty well armoured, they weren't hitting a great deal. But my rolls, as you said during the actual session, my rolls for damage when they did hit were pretty much near the top end of the scale. So it was a really sort of interesting and slightly odd combat, because our zombies are clawing at you, and they spent 6 rounds just patting on your armour and doing nothing, and then one of them had hit and someone would be like, oh, 8 hit points of damage, oh Christ, I'm not looking so good.
And in a way it was kind of like a good old zombie movie in that way. Fantasy stuff, plate mail armor, all that, but the idea of these slow, sort of cumbersome enemies that come at you en masse, and you're trying to block them at the doorway or whatever in a zombie movie, and they're not great. They're very slow and inept at what they're trying to do, but they're trying their best at it. Yeah. And it's attrition, and that's what happened to us as well. We are very hard to hit from the zombie perspective, but all they need is one hit, because that's what the zombie do.
That's it, and because I was using the standard figures from Old School Essentials, the number of them that appear, so you get a sort of here's a dice range to what you get in a random encounter. Here's the dice range you'll get if they're in a lair or a dungeon. So because I was all right, okay, I'll just roll once on the lair, and that's how many zombies the dude's got in the dungeon. All right, 14. Right, okay, so there's only 14 zombies in this thing. If it had just been one zombie per player character, you guys would have just laughed it off. No problems, because you've just been okay, maybe they've hit us twice, but we've just floored them. Great, because you were slapping down zombies like it was going out of fashion.
Yeah, because I have the sort of zombie killing, no problem.
But like I say, with it being the zombie movie style, where it's there's 4 of you guys, there's 14 of them. So even if you're taking down 2-3 a turn, that's still a good number of turns where there's more zombies just crowding in. And like I say, at the start you're we've taken a couple of hits, it's fine, you're slapping them left, right and centre with the sun sword. But then as the rounds go on, you're oh, actually I've taken 5 hits now, I'm not looking so good, and there's still 8 of them left. Or we had a couple of rounds where you guys just got bad rolls and didn't kill any of that round.
Yeah, that was that's the sort of emotional payload of the game for me, for a lot of these sort of more intense battles that we've had, is the okay, I'm on 1 hit point. Also, I can affect this situation a lot if I just manage to make this one roll.
Yeah.
And I've biffed it several times against your vampires, against these zombies here.
Yep.
Things that I might have just obliterated in one go, or at least severely sent reeling, like I did with the vampires in several sessions ago. And because I know the incredible potential that I can bring with the Sun Sword, specifically when we've had a lot of undead people on board here. So the undead always exciting times for me, because I know that I can stride in and I can make a real difference with the Sun Sword. And then when I biff it, it's always oh no, because I was really hoping that would have hit, because not only am I now in this exposed position, but no one else has the Sun Sword. I need to hit with it, because otherwise, with the vampires as well, like Dave has the silver daggers, which I think worked on the vampires, but other than that, I don't think at the time we had the barbarian at such a level where Darren would have been able to, tag, whatever the wording of that rule is that he has now, that where he can tag the sort of magically disinclined.
It's. I mean, I think with that class, it's a bit of a sort of balance thing, because obviously barbarians have that thing where, like, unless it's a magic item from their tribal tradition, they can't use magic, and it's like, obviously he's got like his like spear of the hunter. But like, there's a limit to how many times you can be like, oh, it just so happens to be an ancient artifact of your people. So they tend to like get magic stuff a lot less rapidly and frequently than other people. So they've sort of given that ability where after a certain level, with their normal attacks, even though they don't do any extra damage, they can still like hit creatures that normally you can only hit with magic, because they don't get a lot of it, basically.
Yeah. But that brings in the juice. I presume probably for Darren as well in some form, because he has a character that can make a lot of impact in the sort of fighty situations, and for me it is fun. Like, I enjoy the fights that we do almost always, and the more we run into trouble and the worse it goes, the better it gets for me, because I'm one of those people who took it to heart, where there's advice floating around in the Powered by the Apocalypse game spheres, where originally from Avery Alder, about playing your characters like they were stolen cars. That's entirely my jam, especially in sort of quote unquote deadly D20 stuff. Like, I enjoy every time I'm like one roll away from dropping it in your game.
I feel very much the same way. I mean, the thing is, obviously you don't deliberately try and get your characters killed, but the only thing I'm sort of like worried about is, like, and particularly having played like OSR games, is like having a death that's like boring. Like, if I die, so like, if you just like walked into a room and you were like, oh no, a cart's fell over and I've been like crushed under watermelons or whatever. If like say every combat you go into or whatever, you're like really like playing it to the hilt, then even if you die in it, as long as you like had like fun and you got some like cool stuff that happened during that combat, I'm like really happy. And to take it back to like Chronicle of the Crowns, we're talking about the fight against the Shadow of Despair. For anyone who's not watched it, we're effectively fighting against this like legendary sort of beast, the Shadow of Despair, and it's got this like wave of despair that like rolls off it, and it can sort of like freeze your heart in your chest, and you have to make effectively a save against it. And we all failed. I'd luckily drank like some magic well juice that like I'd got on me, so I was like proof against it. But then I'm suddenly like, the guys who've actually got the magic who can like feasibly do something about it, they're all like incapacitated for a number of rounds. And like my knight character, I'm like, oh well, I've got like full plate armor and a shield. Right, I'm just gonna try. I can't really hurt this thing because my rolls ain't that good, and I'm just gonna try and like but my defense is pretty good. I'm just gonna try and keep this thing off them until they've got a chance to recover and they can like deal the damage to it. And with that, if like I say, I'm wielding my shield, this thing's slapping me about the place like it's going out of fashion, and I'm like struggling back up like with my shield bent around my like arm and whatever. But I'm like, if I had died in that scene, my character, I'd have just been like, oh yeah, but at least I went out in a cool fashion, like trying to like fend off this like great beast or whatever. Whereas the only thing that I wouldn't have liked in that scene is if we'd have like all failed and like the thing had just killed us. That would have been pretty boring.
You guys step into the room, everyone is like frozen in fear and terror. The thing just walks up and goes like in one fell swoop, so tuk, 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 3 decapitated heads, game over. How did you like the campaign, guys?
And like I say, it'd be similar in like Smoke and Snow. Like if you guys had, because you guys quite smartly were like, oh, all these zombies are pouring up the stairway. If we block the stairs, only a couple of them can get to us at a time, and we can sort of funnel them in that way. Whereas if you guys had like backed off a bit, and I was like, oh yeah, 14 zombies come flooding out, and you're dead in like 2 rounds, I'd have been like, oh, isn't it? Yeah, exactly, yeah. So yeah, I agree with you. Like, you're playing your characters like you're riding a stolen car, because for one thing, it's just more fun. And for another, like say, even if you do die or like the worst happens in a scenario, you can be like, well, at least I did my best and I had some like fun while I was like power sliding my character into the bin.
Yeah.
Rather than like, oh, I was just stood there and I got like hit by an orc over the back of the head with a rock, and that was me done.
Yeah, I mean, if a character of mine in one of your games literally does the power slide, power metal's playing in the background, and they die at the end, that's what I signed up for. That's what I wanted. I'm happy with that.
I mean, I think as well, like another thing I enjoyed in like Smoke, so like the only sort of casualty for the zombies was Lan, the NPC. It was like Darren's character's wife, and she got like tore apart by the zombies. And fair play to like Darren, like he's sort of like, obviously he's like a barbarian, so like it steeled his resolve, and he like gritted his teeth. He's like, well, I'm definitely going to wipe out these zombies now. But like he made like, and obviously we didn't go into like full like emotive scenes of him like, oh my god, what's up? But like he kept sort of like doing like little referrals like back to it during the scene. So like even though he's like the typical like hench manly man like barbarian, it was like, oh, like a bead of sweat runs into my face, or maybe it's a tear. But, and just that stuff like that I thought was like really cool, and I enjoy obviously like it's an unfortunate thing when an NPC affiliated with your character gets wiped out, but I enjoyed like the additional complications and the sort of additional like emotion that it added to that scene, because it went from suddenly like you guys being like, oh, we're in a dungeon, we're fighting these zombies because like these zombies are coming for us, and it suddenly turned into like, oh, Darren's character Brock now wants some like revenge because like they've killed his wife, and it's like made it a little bit more personal.
Yeah, and also the like repercussions of that, because I think we ended up, or Darren did end up with like a cremation.
Well, he didn't actually cremate her in the end.
We just talked about how that might have happened. So we still have land there, the earthly remains of land, which I think starting next session, depending on like everything really, but I think there will be, at least by yours truly, going to be floated the idea of like we need to carry Lan out of here. Like this is clearly not the place we're going to leave Lan now. Yeah. So that's going to be interesting, getting Lan's remains out of here now. It's
just added like an additional, like I said, we're talking about complications. It's added an additional complication and sort of like an objective to a scene that could have otherwise been very simple, like kill the zombies, get out of the dungeon. Whereas now it's like, oh, we're all beaten and we're all sort of down. We've got to like fight a defensive action, but also we've got to go out and like retrieve our fallen comrade. So like we're not leaving the body to the necromancer. We've also got to work out a way of getting through this like magically sealed gate. How are we going to do that? So instead of it's gone from a fairly simple scene to like, oh, there's like multiple different objectives we've potentially got to like worry about.
Yeah.
And I think again that's something that has happened a lot in like the Burning Wheel game. Like obviously we started out fairly simple, in the scope of things. Right, we're adventuring to try and retrieve this crown. That it's been like prophesied like Matthew's character is going to like become the king. Now we've got the crown, and now it's like, all right, okay, now how do we make him the actual king? Because like he's just a king in name at the minute. He's not really got all the kingly regalia apart from the crown. All right, okay, now we've got all these other forces coming in. How do we marshal our own forces after we've got some to actually face down these enemies? And it's just sort of like, it sort of extends out almost like a web of sort of like, like when you hit like a pane of glass or something, you see like, or you see like someone walking on an icy lake in a movie, you see like the cracks spread out.
Yeah.
And then they keep spreading out. Both the games sort of strike me very much like you start off with the one sort of initial complication, and then the player actions sort of spread out from there. Yeah.
And I do enjoy that a lot. And it does leave the room, like we said a little bit before, the possibility of just leaving out stacks and stacks of unresolved things you can return to at your leisure. Yeah. Or the person running the game, such as yourself, you brought back some stuff that we never resolved. For example, like the Fire Lord. Like we talked about that guy a lot, but then things came up, we went elsewhere, the world changed, and guy's still there. You brought him back to the front in a different form, and Yeah, I do enjoy that. It brings a sort of continuity, a sense of history to the setting, the game, and it feels like, I suppose, yeah, there's a sense of verisimilitude in the fact that like things don't go away necessarily, even if like you're not there doing the thing about it constantly, and it sort of stays with you through the game. I enjoy that.
It also helped for me that I found like a really simple sort of like, in inverted commas, like faction sort of management system. So obviously we've talked a bit about like the stars without number and worlds without number systems, which are a mini game unto themselves.
Yeah, they are.
Which is
totally fun for the GM.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, but it was like more complex than what I needed for a D&D game. And I found, I think it was online, like a really simple system where it's basically you take like a dice for each of the factions, and like you pick like a dice with more sides for a more powerful faction and a dice with less for like a weaker faction. Then you basically roll them in like a little tray or something, and any of the dices that sort of touch like some event or interaction has occurred between those factions, and you basically look at the numbers that have been rolled, and whichever dice has the highest number, that's the faction that came out the best in whatever situation occurred. So it's fairly loose, and you still have to decide what the interactions are. But it just means every couple of games I can just like roll a handful of dice, and I can be like, all right, yeah, the Fire Lords had an interaction with like this group here. So oh yeah, and but this group came off the best. So have they maybe managed to like infiltrate his like forces, or have they forced some of his forces back, or whatever? And it just allows me to like keep things going, but it's not me 100% sort of planning stuff out, because I like to have a bit of a plan, but I also like a little bit of randomness. So it's not just me being like, right, I know that if the players do nothing in X sessions, the Fire Lord is going to wipe out these 6 villages, which you can do. I've done it in the past. That works fine, but I'd much rather, for me, like have it where I can be like, oh, okay, the Fire Lord's doing his thing. Then I get one of these rolls, and I'm like, all right, okay, so he's had some sort of interaction where he's come out best against Brackenwold, say, and I can like, oh, maybe which is what happened when his forces attacked like Castle Brackenwold, and they sort of like they blew up the gates. That was a random roll, and I was like, all right, the number's only slightly higher for them, so it's not like a mad victory. What could they have done? All right, they've sent like a saboteur in, they've like blown up the gates. Loads of stuff came off that, which was all off that little dice roll. It wasn't something I'd sort of like pre-planned like sessions before.
Yeah, and that also just it's wonderful because it added on to the other stuff that we had run into, because we knew about these infiltrators before, and then we sort of updated our understanding of the Brackenwold area, and we're like, well, yikes, we need to deal with this stuff over here. And we rock up, and what do you know, they have the same problems as we do with the infiltrators, and they're getting, saboteurs in addition to infiltrators. So suddenly this is me thinking when this was going on in the game, now we have potential allies. We could do some stuff now with Brackenwall, because we have a common quote unquote enemy, in that the Fire Lord just threatens everyone at this point. So that's cool, because it was not the case. I did not think about that before that thing happened, that we went there and looked at the thing. I was like, well, it looks like there's a hole in your castle wall. What gives?
Yeah.
And that was a random event, turns out. So definitely, that one paid off, at least like for my experience. That is a lot of payoff for like a die roll.
Yeah, and like I say, system. Obviously, as we've said, as a GM, you have like enough planning to do for a session, for like the immediate stuff that's going on with the session. So much as I wholeheartedly endorse and love having stuff going on in the background to make it seem like a real sort of like lived in world where stuff's progressing, I also don't want to be like, right, okay, I've got to spend like a few hours like planning the session. I don't want to then have to spend like an additional few hours like planning for stuff that's happening off stage. Or if I do plan it, I don't want to spend the same amount of time. But I do think it's necessary to sort of have stuff happening off stage. Whereas just being able to like, right, I've done all my planning, and what I normally do is like at the very start of the session, I'll do like my faction roll, and I'll be like, all right, okay, has anything of interest happened? All right, is any of it likely to impact the stuff the players are like looking at. Because I ask you guys what you're going to do on the previous session, and if it does, I like sort of work it up in a bit more detail. Whereas if it doesn't, I can be like, right, well, I've just got to have a general idea of what's happening. So the whole like Brackenwold stuff, because I said didn't really think you'd be going straight to Brackenwold. I was like, okay, yeah, some saboteurs have caused some damage to the gate. They were discovered and they were killed, but they're now on sort of high alert. And that was pretty much all I had planned for that. But it could, like we're saying, the most difficult thing being to make like the first mark on that page. Because I'd already got that. When you guys are like, all right, we're heading off to Brackenwold, I can immediately be like, right, well, I know roughly what's going on there, so all I've got to do is fill in these like little details, like, oh yeah, there's like watch captains like watching over the carpenters and the masons and stuff like that. It's a bit slow going, and then you guys are like, oh well, maybe we could like hook you up with some stonemasons from like from our town, and we could like help you, and like maybe we can get this whole like trade thing going on, and it all sort of spirals off from there, which I thought was a really nice payoff for it.
Yeah. Overall, like stuff like that is, I don't know, it's just the wonderful sort of ignition blocks, I guess, for the collaborative fiction that is the result of us bouncing around in this game. It's, I suppose that's the reason why we do this whole thing, the sort of collaborative thing that we have at the end, the story that we have of the things that happened at the end of.
And it's often put about in sort of OSR circles, like, because obviously a lot of OSR people are very sort of scathing of like the storytelling games, and it's often sort of put about that in an OSR game the story is just like whatever happens in the game, and you discussing it afterwards. You don't start out with sort of like a ready-made story or something like that. But which I sort of agree with, particularly in terms of like D&D, like if you like open world stuff like I do, then yeah, the story is whatever the player characters decide to do. So if we started like Smoke and Snow and we're like, all right, yeah, and obviously we talked about like what the sort of goal was going to be, the initial, we're reclaiming our ancient homeland. So like, I wouldn't expect on the first session you guys, but actually we don't fancy settling a village here. We're going to like get back on the boat and we're going to take the boat, we're going to become pirates raiding the coast. But if you guys had have said that, I'd have gone, all right. And we'd have sort of gone with that, and the game would have gone off in an entirely different direction, and the story would have been entirely different. Whereas I think, obviously, in the Burning Wheel game again, we discussed everything so like beforehand, so we knew what we were sort of getting into. We had input in that, but I do feel that, like, particularly like Burning Wheel with the way it's set up, it benefits more from having a more sort of defined starting point for the story. As we've sort of said earlier, rather than just being a sort of like, here's the map, go, like you can do in D&D. Yeah. And, well, yeah, there's a whole other episode to do about, like, storytelling game. I don't think it's... Well,
there
you go. I'll take that as tacit approval for me to, like, try and book you in for that, like, episode at some point in the future.
I suppose we'll save that for later.
Although I don't know how much I'd have to say on it, because my response would typically be like, I like a bit of story games. I like a bit of D&D games.
Yeah, I think it's going to be one of those 5-minute episodes where you say that, and I say, why does this term exist? What's a story game? Because of course, every one of us does have our own take on things, obviously. I don't think that terminology is particularly useful.
Yeah.
And it's just not useful for me at all.
I think as well, I'm finding, like, as I get like to be an even older, like, grumpier man, that as I sort of, like, a lot of these conversations I've already sort of seen and I've been involved in, like, online about, what is the OSR, what's a story game, what's railroading, what's this, that and the other, which I don't begrudge anyone having those discussions. No. But, like, I've had them so many times myself that now when people sort of raise them with me, I'm like, well, I'll tell you what, once you've decided what it is, come back to me and then we'll sort of, like, move on. And obviously, like, no one ever comes back to you because, like, there's never going to be a case where, like a sort of Nicene Council where, like, every role player...
Grand conclave of RPGs.
Every role player sits down across the land and goes, like, right, according to the proclamation of the year of our Lord 2022, it is now decreed that the OSR means this and a storytelling game is this. and there shall be no railroading in the future.
Yeah, and for some reason, these two things are opposite, and at odds forever.
Yeah.
Now, as is probably apparent from my tone there, I find it to be a waste of effort, really, to fence around in that particular circle. And I guess, much as you refer to like being an old grumpy man, I've also reached that point quite a few years ago now, where it's like I would rather not engage in that, because I don't think there's a lot there to be gained.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, I don't begrudge anyone having the discussions, but I'm at that sort of stage now where I'm like, do you know what? I'd rather save my energy for actually playing the games.
Yeah. That's a discussion someone else can have if they would want to.
Yeah.
I'm just here to enjoy and play some games.
And I'm not going to say that I'm sort of like whiter than white or anything like that. Certainly, like a good handful of years ago, I was quite happily one of the people who, like, if you were like, oh, what do you think of modern D&D? I'd be like, modern D&D is rubbish. Go back to the old D&D. Blah, 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 blah. But now I'm at the stage where, like, do you know what? Like, so someone else playing like a version of D&D I'm not particularly fond of. Does it impact me? Not really. Worst case scenario, if someone's like, hey, do you want to play a game in like 5th edition or whatever? I'd be like, to be honest, if it was like a GM I knew in a group I liked, I'd probably be like, yeah, fine. Because as we've said, like the systems, or for me, is almost like the secondary thing. I mean, we've played no end of systems where I'm like, oh, do you know what? If we didn't have a good group, this system could be like pretty crappy. But it's been good because of the GM and the group. And like I say, my friend Robbie was talking about coming down at some point and running some D&D 3.5 edition for us. And I'm like, it's not my favourite edition, but I've been in games he's run before. I really enjoyed them. We're playing with a group of people I know. We'll probably have fun. I've played in 5th edition. I've had fun. We've had a good group. It's been great. Yeah.
And I've threatened, like, this is some years ago now, because time is not real anymore. I feel like, but it's been several years now. But I've also threatened to run some 5e for our little group here. And I guess we'll see if that ever comes to fruition. But that's also being uttered, and I will agree with your statement of, we've played some, let's call, like, dank designs. And we've had a grand old time with them. A highlight of my particular one that I constantly bring up in our pre-game chats when we go off on various rants is one of my all-time favorites, Vampire the Masquerade. There's some very deep-seated sort of manufacturing flaws that I view as flaws in the design of that particular game that I have been a sort of constant specter hovering over my role-playing enjoyment and hobby for I suppose since I started, because Vampire was one of those early games for me. And it's never stopped me from enjoying the game. It's just you deal with the thing that you have on the table at the moment. You adjust things if that's what you want to do, and you have a good time with hopefully some nice people around the table. And we keep doing that. And so I suppose what I'm sort of starting to drive towards with all of this is, like, you can have a great time with almost anything. There's that almost, because some games, there are some that I would just not at all, not even gonna look at it. But for most games, it's you can make it into something you can enjoy, even if
I always enjoy it as well when, like, people have said to me about various systems, like the live action version of Vampire at the Mind's Eye Theatre, and people have said, like, oh, is it like a good system? And I'll be like, no, it's a terrible system. And then they're like, oh, have you played it? And I'm like, yeah, I've played in like 18 games during the course of my life, some of which went for years. And they're like, well, why did you play them if it's so like such a dank system? And I'm like, well, but because I enjoyed the people I was gaming with. It was like an interesting story,
good time,
and you can put up with a lot for a system as long as you're still having fun in the actual game.
Yeah, I suppose like this is getting very high concept here now, but like I think overall it's everything's compromised
Yeah,
in life somehow, some way. Everything is compromised, and most of the time you can have a great time with playing role playing. That's why we keep doing it, and that's even though like we have these like passionate arguments about terminology and taxonomy of what is a game, and is it a featherless pipette or but like that's we keep doing this, yet we stick around for the hobby.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, to use an analogy as well, like you say, most of life is about compromise. I mean, take work for instance. Like, I would say that like 99.9% of people probably don't have a day job that they absolutely love. But you sort of go, right, okay, well, I need money to pay my bills, keep a roof over my head, do this, that, and the other, and this job allows me to do with that, and I can sort of tolerate the bits I don't like for the sake of having money and being able to like live in a house and stuff like that. And if you get to a stage where you're like, oh, despite the fact it's provided for my lifestyle, I really can't put up with like the shortcomings, that's when you leave your job, you look for something else. You know, but much as with games as well, you're like, you get to a point where you're, okay, there's X, Y, and Z I don't like about the system. However, how much of my enjoyment are they ruining? Because like, if it's just like occasionally a bit of a mechanic comes up and you're like, but the rest of the game's great, then you're like, you know, I can put up with that like slightly poor mechanic for the sake of the rest of the game that I'm enjoying.
Yeah, and it does help to take stuff in its context, because that gives you some tools to understand why that thing that grates you so is the way it is. Yeah,
and like I say, if you to carry on like the job analogy, as with a job, if you get to a point when you're like, do you know what, this mechanic that drives me up the wall, it's coming up like every 5 minutes. I'm at the point where I'm no longer enjoying the game because of that. That's the point when you go like, maybe I need to like stop playing this system or stop playing this game. But if it's just a case of like, oh, every now and again, I'm like, oh, that's a bit subpar. But I'm enjoying 99.9% of the rest of the game. Yeah, well, that's fine. Like I said, there's not really a perfect game out there.
No. And the pursuit of that, and I know that there's folks out there, I know them, some of them personally in real life, in physical meat space, who sort of are gradually, even though they realize that, oh, I'm looking for the perfect game, they still return to that quest time and again, after like a brief love affair with one game that is the perfect game, and then honeymoon is over, it's no longer the perfect game, the quest is back on.
That's right, we're talking about you, Lloyd.
I haven't been in the same physical space with Lloyd. Lloyd's not on my list. Don't, you know.
Well, no. Obviously, like, joking aside, speaking very generally here, I think when it comes to like the perfect game, there's like, roughly speaking, like two categories of people. And I would say Lloyd, and I'm sure he would be the first to admit this, he plays a game for a bit, he throws everything, all of his passion into a game.
He dissects the game as well.
He loves it. He really like delves deeply into it because he wants to like, understand everything about it, and he's really enthused about it. But the danger of doing that is when you sort of, to my mind, obviously it's just my opinion, when you're sort of like, you're that sort of impassioned about a game and you think, yes, is this the mythical perfect game I've found? Eventually, inevitably, you start noticing like little cracks in the armor and little bits where you're like, oh, I'm not really keen on that. And then you've got one of two choices. You either, like I've sort of done, you either accept, oh, there's probably not a perfect game. I'm going to find a few games that have got minimal flaws, or like flaws I can live with, and I'm going to run them and have a good time. Or, as Lloyd would, I'm sure, admit that he does, you continue that quest, as you were saying, you move on to the next game, and you go like, oh, maybe this is the perfect game, and you throw everything into that. And I think both approaches, they're equally valid. You know, I mean, I would say I've played in like numerous sort of like one shots and stuff like that Lloyd's run of games when he's throwing himself in it, and you can really tell with every game he runs, he's very passionate about running that game. and he always brings that like 110% to like every game he runs, because he does just throw all of himself into running a game. And yeah, okay, like three, and I often jibe with him about like, oh, 3 months down the line you think this game is like the worst game ever and it's trash, and he'll be the first to admit that. But for those like 3 months when he's all about that game, like, I think you'd be hard pushed to find anyone who's more enthusiastic or like brings their sort of A game as consistently as him to a game, because he is so like wanting it to be like the perfect game.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Whereas I think for myself, I probably don't throw myself in quite as much as him, because I'm at the stage where I've sort of accepted, oh, there isn't a perfect game. Obviously, I'll try and run the best game I can, but I'm sort of like, I'm not going to run like D&D and pretend it's not got flaws. I'm not going to run Vampire and pretend it's the perfect game, because we all know it isn't. But let's just like put up with its flaws, or sort of like go, oh, they're just part of it. They're like endearing flaws, and let's just have fun and like run a game.
Yeah, and I think a part of this is as well to consider is, even if you found the perfect game, you as a person will, I guarantee this, you will not stay the same person across decades of your life. So you will drift, and your taste will develop in games. This is like, I'm speaking for me. Like, this is what happened to me.
Yeah.
Like, I have developed a vastly different taste than, let's say, 10 to 15 years ago. I enjoyed different things about different games. I enjoyed a different variety of games, and things that I held up as like, this is the coolest thing ever.
Yep.
Now might be a sort of like cherished memory of like, oh yeah, like those were some good days. But I've not touched that thing for 10 years now, and I don't see myself doing it almost ever again, aside from maybe like flipping through it and being like, oh yeah, that was some cool stuff we might have done back then. But I
mean, I did a similar thing with as you know, when I first started doing like videos and whatever, I was all about the game Fate.
Yeah.
And like every other game I ran was Fate. I had like all the various different Fate worlds and Dresden Accelerated and all of that. And I still enjoy Fate now. I've got very fond memories of all the games I've ran with it. But it's not the sort of like first game that springs to mind when I go, oh, I'm going to run a new game now. Whereas like a few years ago, if someone had said, oh, we've got some players who want an RPG running, John, do you fancy running something for them? I'd have been like, Fate, I'm going to run some variety of Fate. And I'd have done that. And obviously I know I ran Fate for like you guys a number of times online. Whereas now I'm more sort of like into like the OSR games and stuff like that. And again, I'm not saying they're perfect, but they've sort of like supplanted, I suppose, if you want to call it that, Fate as like the
go-to.
Go-to. So like, if someone's like, oh, I want you to run a quick game, and you're like, all right, I haven't got a lot of prep time. What can I run that I can do a good game of?
Here's some White Star. Like we're gonna do, phasers. Like that's already, we're on board now.
And I had a similar thing, as you know, when I was running the Fantasy Flight games like Star Wars. I was all about that for like a while, and like I ran loads of games of that. Whereas I've not basically touched it since then. I still have fond memories of running the game, but when I look at it now, I'm like, oh, do you know what? If I wanted to run a Star Wars game, there's probably other systems I could do it with easier and without as much effort, you know. So we've talked about the Hyperspace D6 sort of like fan game and stuff like that.
Yeah, by Matt Click.
Yeah, Matt Click. Yeah, the old West End Games D6 that it was based on. There's the D20 Star Wars, which I've got most of. So there's lots of options for that. Or again, like something like Fate, I could easily go, oh, I'm going to use Fate to run a Star Wars game.
Yeah,
that is
which we did. We swapped that one campaign mid-stride from FFG Star Wars to Fate Accelerated. Was it? I think it was. Yeah. So definitely, I think, and this isn't me saying like, oh, this is the truth. Like, no one will enjoy this. Of course, like people will stick. We all probably know someone who's still doing that thing they were doing 30 years ago in their own homebrew world. Yeah, and that is like the magnum opus. I've never. Obviously, I don't have that, and I don't think I ever will. I'm just too, I suppose, I like to sample things, to put it in words.
And I was going to say, just to like butt in there, I think again that's a benefit of like the approach like Lloyd uses, because if you say to like me, like, how many games have you run, I can, like, over the course of your life, I can probably go, oh, there's maybe 30 odd games I've run over the course of my life, and there's probably like half of them that I'm still familiar with. I can just pick them up and run with. Whereas if you say to like Lloyd, like, how many games have you run in the course of your life, he'd be like, hold on while I get this like massive file of facts out and like run through the list. Because so his exposure to like different types of games, different rule systems, different ways of running games is far vaster than mine, and I do think that helps him when he sits down to GM a new games. He's got that vast experience he can pull on, whereas I think my experience has probably been like a little more focused.
Yep. I think there's definitely stuff to be gained just from being exposed to different ways of going about things in this hobby. I think that's a definite strength. And there's obviously there is a very clear strength to also dedicating yourself to one particular aspect of the craft.
Yeah, I mean that's some. We're talking about like persistent campaign modes and stuff like that. That's something I'm sort of like low key trying to sort of do at the minute with like the
Smoke and Snow,
with Smoke and Snow, well, the world of like Valconen, because my basic idea is that I'll set this campaign setting up. Then like any time I want to run an OSR fantasy game, like, and I know Rob Davis has like done this, run it in that same campaign world, maybe move the time on a bit, focus on a different area, but like keep it in the same campaign world and like build the world up in that fashion. But I also don't think I'm ever going to be like, all right, I'm only running fantasy games and they're all set in this one world, because, well, as we've said, like the new Mothership's coming out at some point. I'm going to want to run that, and I can't set that in the same world. I want to run Worlds Without Number at some point. I could possibly fit that into the same world, maybe, but I'd have to sort of. I mean, obviously I've read through the book a while back, but I'd have to have a look through it and go like, oh, how much of the game would I have to sacrifice to fit it into this campaign setting? And if I'm carving out too much of it, is it worth trying to run that system in the setting, or should I just do something a bit different? Because if I'm going to run a game, I may as well take advantage of the stuff in that game. Well, like I said, I want to run 5th edition Vampire again at some point. I'm not going to be able to run that in Valconen, so So. I don't think I could be. When you get people who are like, oh, we've been running the same campaign for like 60 years, and it's in the same setting. Which is why I'm sort of doing it low key, because although I'm like, oh, I could run a consistent setting for like most of my OSR fantasy games, I don't think I could keep running the same campaign for that length of time. Yeah,
because I think there's a different beast.
At some point, I'm going to want a bit of a break from that, or I'm going to want to do something different, and that might be like, oh, I'm going to run some sci-fi for a bit, or it might just be as simple as like, oh, you guys have resolved the big plot involving like the god swords. All right, we're going to run another OSR fantasy game, but like, let's focus it on something a bit different, so it's a bit of a change of pace, even if we're doing like ostensibly a fantasy game again.
I think there's a lot of, we've already laid a lot of sort of dominoes ready for different areas in that world to make new campaigns happen, and switching the location of a campaign around. Maybe we end up going back to the other continent that we know about, like the bigger stuff that we know about. There's no doubt islands and shit. But, But we might go there because we have trade ships going across the sea and all that.
Things as well. I was sort of like, the way I'm imagining sort of in my head at the minute the campaign world working is very much on the sort of like the Star Trek like TV series model, where they sort of went, okay, we've got this original series Star Trek, it's focusing on the Federation and the Enterprise and this, that and the other. Then they were like, all right, we're doing the next generation, right? Time's moved forward by like 100 years. and now we're doing the same sort of thing, but it's 100 years in the future. And then they're like, oh, we want a slightly more sort of like military, like gritty thing. All right, we're going to do like Deep Space Nine, which is in the same universe, but there's very different set of circumstances. It's on this previously occupied space station with protecting this world, very different. Then they're like, oh, we want to do something a bit different now, so we're going to have like Voyager, it's like lost in a different quadrant of space. Then they're like, oh, we're going to nip back earlier in the time period, we're going to do like Enterprise. So I sort of like envision like being able to jump around in like time and location within the same campaign world, because we know the broad strokes of like, well I've got sort of written down the broad strokes of like the past of the world, but that's in the case for like looking at it and being like, oh, this was the age of serpents when a great serpent empire rose or whatever. But you've got like 1,000 years to play with, where there's like no sort of exact like ABCD progression written down, where you could feasibly run like I've spoke about running swords and sorcery. I could feasibly go like, right, I'm going to run in the distant past of like the world of Arconan, a sword and sorcery game when like this serpent empire was like at the height of its power or whatever, or it had just fallen, and that would be very different from the game we had now, but it'd still be filling in some of the background of the campaign.
Yeah, I think there's definitely space there for using these examples. Like, you're setting the Great Serpent Empire has just fallen, and you start your Wolves Without Number game right there, because it's kind of post-apocalyptic in a fantasy sense. There's sort of like setting that comes with the book that you don't need to use, obviously, but because that would give a little bit more freedom with like what can happen, because we just had this like central power collapse. So things are spreading around, people are taking what they can, and maybe, I don't know, you're serpent folk, but maybe they also had a bunch of different kinds of magic running about, which would give you more, justification to use the material in the book.
Well, assuming I go with like an OSR game for when I do get around to running some swords and sorcery, because I do want to do that. My current thoughts are, because I backed Hyperborea. My current thoughts are, it'll be in the future when this happens, so I should have those books by then.
The distant future.
Yeah, the distant future. So my current thoughts are basically like sit down with like Worlds Without Number, Hyperborea, and go like, oh, like which one of these do I think could work best for this type of game, and then just pick one and be like, oh, you guys interested in like doing some swords and sorcery set in like bajillions of years in the past of like this same world. So that's it for this episode. We hope you'll join us next time when we have the final part of our discussion about long-running campaigns and the campaigns that we're running at the moment. We hope you enjoyed the episode. If you'd like to get in touch and maybe tell us what you think of long-form campaigns, or let us know about the best long-form campaign you've run, you can get in touch a number of different ways. You can leave us a voicemail message using either SpeakPipe or Anchor, link in the description of this episode, or you can send us an email to rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. So until we see you again, take care, stay safe, and whenever you're playing, have fun.